In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. Amen. Won't you be seated? In the gospel lesson we just heard, on this feast day of St. Francis, Jesus teaches that you cannot serve God and wealth. Therefore I tell you, he says, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Do not worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Wow, what an extraordinary statement. Jesus doesn't want his followers to worry about tomorrow's needs, really? Or about what they'll eat or wear in the future? Is he sure? Jesus makes this a condition of discipleship. You cannot serve, it says in the King James Version, both God and mammon, you might remember. Mammon is an Aramaic word that means wealth or property and signifies a choice that is not of God, but one driven by greed and avarice. Jesus knows our human nature so well. He knows that the human person can only concentrate on one thing at a time. I don't think Jesus would have agreed with the modern notion that multitasking is a virtue. Jesus wants his people to concentrate on what matters most, to monotask. Look beyond the day-to-day concerns of food and clothing and see the bigger picture, says Jesus in the Gospels. He advises his followers to focus their attention on God, the Creator and Sustainer of all that is. Food and clothing pale in comparison to the love of God shown through Jesus Christ. Fully concentrating on day-to-day living can lead one astray from God if food and clothing and shelter become the priority, as it is at the moment for those affected by hurricanes, for example, in Florida and South Carolina. In the consumer society in which we live today, there's always the temptation for bigger, more expensive, the latest fashion or technology, and the most popular. Any of these whims could change tomorrow and the cycle begins anew. This is why Jesus says that the person cannot serve both God and wealth. Serving wealth will take one's full and undivided attention and all of one's resources. Instead, Jesus wants his followers to focus on God and God's call to a life based in Jesus and his teachings. These are the things that are permanent. Food, clothing, shelter are all perishable in the end. What is not perishable is one's relationship with God. It takes a certain maturity in faith to look beyond the perishable and concentrate solely on God. For the person who does, life takes on new meaning. The latest whims of the market take on less priority. Learning to live with what one has becomes easier, and one has the ability to live well with less. Francis, the son of a prosperous merchant of Assisi, was born in 1182 and came to know this truth. His early youth was spent in harmless revelry and fruitless attempts to win military glory. Various encounters with beggars and lepers pricked the young man's conscience, and he decided to embrace a life devoted to Lady Poverty. Despite his father's intense opposition, Francis totally renounced all material values and devoted himself to serve the poor. In 1210, Pope Innocent III confirmed the simple rule for the order of Friars Minor, a name Francis chose to emphasize his desire to be numbered among the least of God's servants. The order grew rapidly all over Europe, but by 1221, Francis had lost control of it, since his idea of strict and absolute poverty, both for the individual friars and for the order as a whole, was found to be too difficult to maintain. His last years were spent in much suffering of body and spirit, but his unconquerable joy never failed. In his latter years, he was ordained as a deacon, but he resisted all efforts to persuade him to become a priest. Not long before his death, during a retreat on Mount Laverna, Francis received on September 14th, Holy Cross Day, the marks of the Lord's wounds, the stigmata, in his own hands and feet and side. Pope Gregory IX, a former patron of the Franciscans, canonized Francis in 1228 and began the erection of a great basilica in Assisi where Francis is buried. Of all the saints, Francis is perhaps the most popular and admired, but probably the least imitated. Few have attained to his total identification with the poverty and suffering of Christ. Francis left few writings, but of these his spirit of joyous faith comes through most truly perhaps in the Canticle of the Sun, which he composed at Clare's Convent of St. Damian's. The version in the hymnal at number 406 reads this way: Most high, omnipotent, good Lord, to thee be ceaseless praise outpoured and blessing without measure. Let creatures all give thanks to thee and serve in great humility. Francis knew that it was only in prayer that this attitude toward worldly things can be achieved. Food, clothing, and shelter take on less importance in the face of prayer and being in the presence of God. You realize rather quickly that those things don't matter as much. And more importantly, if one makes a conscious decision to spend more time with God, the rest takes care of itself. At the realization that all things come from God, the person becomes satisfied with what is and does not look to the latest fashion or whim. The list of worries begins to shrink, and concerns and issues will be remedied because the disciple believes the list is in God's hands. It's the goal of every follower of Jesus Christ to set his or her sights on Jesus alone and allow him to direct and guide and supply his followers with all they need in this life, and most importantly, with life eternal. Amen.